Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book. I'm so excited to do this book. And perfect timing. I wonder how that happened. This is video number 1 of In Plain Sight by Ross Coulthart. You may recognize the name. Ross is a well-known investigative journalist from Australia, and he most recently interviewed at length the whistleblower who worked in government intelligence and claims knowledge of government programs that have UFOs. They call them UAPs, but I'm going to start right off by telling you I prefer UFO. We know what we're talking about. I'm not implying that we're for sure that these are beings from other physical planets. We don't know about that. The government likes to call them UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, because sometimes it's not an actual craft. But I'm referring to the whole thing as UFO. It's the term I'm comfortable with. He uses the government terms. When they say UAP, he says UAP. But just so we know what we're talking about here. So he interviewed the whistleblower, David Grosh, and Grosh has claimed that the government has a program of UFO retrieval and, when possible, ET body retrieval and back engineering, and that the government has been frantically working on, and when I say government, we're not sure who in the government. There is a committee hearing going on this week to look into this, to talk to this whistleblower, David Grosh. And I'm surprised it's not top headlines. This is the biggest news story in history, if it's true. Now, Ross Coulthart has an interesting background. He was sure, let's put it that way, he was sure that biker gangs were involved in organized crime, their own particular organizations of criminal enterprise. And that seems a given, but at the time that he was investigating it originally, people poo-pooed him. Don't be ridiculous. And he pursued it against all odds, against professional scorn and people telling him he was wasting his time, lots of denials, and eventually was able to do great exposés about biker gangs and criminal activity. He's tenacious. And he's also, and I think this is the most remarkable thing about him, he's extremely level-headed. He's goes double back bends to be unbiased. He follows every single lead. He interviews every single person. He doesn't go into something with an opinion. He's a skeptic. So let's start this book, and I think you're going to be shocked. And as Ross said, and there are some great interviews with him because he's doing the circuit right now. The one I really enjoyed, it made a real impression on me, is a podcast that has a YouTube channel. It's called Surviving the Survivor. And about 2 weeks ago, he did a very long, close to 2-hour interview with that podcast. And you get to hear him talk about this from his own perspective. And what struck me was he kept saying, look, I went into this a skeptic and I was shocked. So with that in mind, let's start with this book. Oh, and then of course, I saw the interview. I've been reading about the whistleblower. This is a topic dear to my heart. Saw the interview, ordered the book, and a couple of days after I ordered the book, I found out that there's a new edition, an updated version coming out in September. I really recommend this book. It's fascinating, and the fact that it is not the updated version is disappointing for me, but it in no way detracts from the ton of evidence. So be prepared. Hold on to your seats. In Plain Sight by Ross Coulthart. His biography, award-winning investigative journalist and writer, previously an investigative reporter on news and current affairs programs, 60 Minutes Australia. He's won 5 prestigious Walkley Journalism Awards, including the most coveted top award for Australian journalism, the Gold Walkley. His broadcast television investigative journalism has also won the top broadcast award, a Logie. He is the co-author of best-selling books Dead Man, Running, and Above the Law, both exposés of organized crimes in Australian and international outlaw motorcycle gangs. This book was written in 2021. Prologue. In 1991, United States Navy, at the United States Navy Communications Station, the Harold A.E. Holt in Exmouth, Northwestern Cape, Australia. So this is an American Navy station in the boonies in Australia. And they were in the process of handing over the facility to the Australians. So the Americans were leaving. And it had a covert role. Americans probably don't even know this thing existed. I never heard of it. And even if you knew it was there, you probably didn't know what its real purpose was. And this is kind of mind-boggling. It's part of a United States submarine-launched nuclear missile facility. In other words, it signals, it's a communication place. It signaled submarines, nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean in case of a nuclear war. The locals were sad to see it leave because it was a huge boost to their local economy. As I said, this is kind of a remote area. What they didn't know, Ross says, is that if there were a nuclear confrontation, they would be wiped off the face of the map probably before mostly anybody because of the sensitivity of these communications. So there was a big party, a farewell to some of the Americans, and a woman named Annie Farinaccio left a little too late in the evening, which came outside, I remember, 1991. She came outside that night and realized that the last cab had left and were in a very remote area. Well, 2 Australian Federal Protective Service police officers were doing their rounds, and they offered her a ride back to town. So they drove along this deserted road for a couple of minutes along the coast, and suddenly, okay, their names are Kevin and Alan. Suddenly, Kevin said, "Oh, it's back. Grab the camera." So Alan fired off many, many photographs through the front window of their Jeep thing, and Annie was perplexed. She didn't see anything. She didn't know what was going on. Kevin told her, "Look up." So she saw a long diamond-shaped craft with rows of lights on the tips of the craft. It was dark gray, and it was about 100 feet above them. And Annie, what she said, I wrote, WTF? So Kevin and Alan had no idea what it was. They just knew it had followed them the previous night, and they had tried to get pictures, but they hadn't responded fast enough. Suddenly, this craft shot up on the right, and sort of they didn't see it. The next thing they knew, it was on their left. Annie screamed because this was weird. And the cops started driving top speed, and this craft chased them for kilometers, and then it just shot up into the sky. And the next thing they knew, it seemed like it landed in the scrub because they could see a light, and in the barren ground to their side. And Annie started to cry, and she said, "Just take me home." So they did. They took her home, but then they returned to the site to take more pictures. Annie locked herself into the house. She said she was completely freaked out. She said that the speed this thing flew at was absolutely incomprehensible. And she says, "I don't care if people think I'm crazy. This thing moved so fast my eyes couldn't follow it." 2 days later, after this event, 2 American military police came to her job and removed her from her job, escorted her out. And she thought, oh, I'm in trouble for drinking at this base party. Maybe we weren't supposed to have alcohol on the base at the party. These guys took her to a top secret area into a private room. And who should be in the room but the 2 cops, Kevin and Alan? And also the American base commander and a couple of other men in suits that she didn't know, and they looked grim. They asked her, what did you see? And she said, well, a UFO, and she drew it. And they said to her at that point, you do realize that you saw a weather balloon. She laughed at them and told them that she'd seen many weather balloons as a child because of her father's work, and this was not a weather balloon. One of the Australians, one of the cops, Kevin or Alan, got really upset and said, please shut up before you get us all killed. They interrogated her for hours. The Australians were obviously terrified. They'd been there much longer than she. When she arrived, they'd already been there for hours. She refused to give in to the bullying. She said, I know what I saw. I saw a UFO. But because she was an Australian civilian, there wasn't a lot they could do, and they took her home. She called her cousin, and her cousin, I guess, lived in the area, and they drove over to Alan, the cop. They drove over to his house. And he told the cousin and Annie that he had shown the pictures to these weird people in this room, and he got arrested. The photos and his camera were confiscated. He told them to never come back to his house. He told Annie and her cousin, don't ever come back here. He was very, very rattled, very scared. Annie's mother confirms all this. So now Ross, when I talk about things being confirmed, I'm not going to belabor the point. He talked to everybody. Her mother confirms all this. The military police first came to her house looking for Annie, and she told them Annie was at work. That's when she got picked up. Work colleagues confirmed that she was marched out by 2 very grim U.S. military people. And she's absolutely adamant it was true. So many similar stories for decades have not been investigated, have not drawn the attention of mainstream media, and they're dismissed, they're ridiculed, and the reality is, from his investigations, he says, that he has discovered, despite the media ridicule, skepticism, and heavy social pressure to brush all this off as crazy, he says governments take it all very seriously. He has seen declassified documents. He has talked with witnesses, eyewitnesses who have corroborated all these stories that he's looked at. He sees a persistent pattern of strange UFOs near sensitive military bases. He's confirmed this unequivocally. He's seen declassified documents from the Northwestern Cape base in Australia that confirms this. He says there's a huge disconnect between the public ridicule and long concealed government secrecy, but it's finally now being revealed, slowly but surely. He's seen recent radar, sensor system, video, and eyewitness evidence. He has seen this personally, and he talks about it later in the book. His sources admit that these objects have technology that far exceeds human science. They go from the air to the ocean and up into orbit and into outer space. And they have been tracked doing this on military brand new sensor systems. I can't even describe them. And then radar. They appear intelligently controlled. He says he's reluctant to believe in cover-ups and conspiracies. He's a skeptic by nature, which is why he went into investigative journalism. But he believes that governments are not telling the full story, whatever that might be. So chapter 1. Let's hope they're friendly. The antipodes. The word antipode, Greek, it means the direct opposite. And it was an old term, long ago, used to talk about the southern hemisphere, specifically Australia and New Zealand. They have had a record of UFO sightings there since, official white reporting, let's put it that way, since the 19th century when early Europeans started invading Australia and New Zealand. Of course, Aborigines have their own stories to tell, but thousands and thousands of years of Aboriginal art and stories about orbs in the outback and things in the sky. They call them min-min lights, that they follow people who are walking in the outback. The Aborigines laugh at recent explanations that the Australian government has made, which, you're just seeing truck lights in the distance. And they just laugh, we've seen these things long before trucks were ever invented. And early newspapers reflect many stories about lights and crafts in the sky. The earliest official government report in Australia is from 1930. The Royal Australian Air Force squadron leader, George Jones, was sent to a place in Victoria in Australia to investigate a report of a UFO. And he reported, quote, "This is not an aircraft that belonged to us or to anyone else." And that's on record. He became the chief of the air staff during World War II, and he became the main air marshal, and these are all military titles in Australian military. He saw and admitted that he'd seen a UFO. He was convinced that we needed serious research, and he supported civilian researchers for a very long time. And they have some examples. Francis Chichester in 1931 was the first solo flight from New Zealand to Australia over the Tasman Sea. And Francis reported seeing, quote, "a dull gray airship. It appeared and it disappeared. It had lights on its nose and back, and it was never explained." He said it was very like the flying saucers. He wrote a book later and described it in the book as very like a flying saucer. The name of the book is The Lonely Sea and the Sky. For example, October 1978, Fred Valentich. Now, this is one of the strangest stories. I've heard a podcast about this where they played the radio communication. I strongly recommend you dig around a little bit, do a little bit of your own investigative journalism, because I forget the podcast. I believe it might have been a strange story type podcast, but this is a true story, and I did hear the radio communication. Valentich, who was 20, was a young guy who was really into airplanes, and he was flying a small Cessna from Melbourne across the Tasman Ocean. And he and the Cessna disappeared after he called in seeing a shiny UFO following him. And he described it in detail, and the last communication from him was panicked. He said, "It's hovering above me and it's not an aircraft." Then it all went dead. They never found any debris or anything. December of 1978, a cargo plane was followed in a place called Kaikoura. This was documented on radar. There happened to be a TV camera crew on board, and the TV cameraman on the plane filmed outside the plane, and he has a video of lights. That's it, lights. No other air traffic reported. And it did appear on radar. The Royal New Zealand Air Force said it was natural but unusual. An atmospheric phenomenon. Witnesses just were confused, the government said, by boats on the ocean. They lost their sense of perspective. Or maybe it was Venus that they saw. And he looked into it and said that this happened. They have documented time, place, time of year, and Venus would not have been visible, and they have no record of any boats on the water. And yeah. So New Zealand Ministry of Science said he totally discounts that this is from outer space. Still one of the best known unexplained events because it's filmed by a TV crew. Media is notoriously skeptical. In the early 1990s, Ross was now a TV investigative journalist, and he was approached by the Australian Air Force insiders to reconsider his skepticism. Two very senior officials told him privately all about UFOs. They told him that they had not been properly investigated by the media or at all by the government. And one of them told him, please don't report this sort of stuff because it's career-ending to admit you see these things. But there's something weird happening that can't be dismissed. Too many of us have seen these objects. So they didn't want him to go off half-cocked. They wanted him to look into it, but not to just blurt it out unless he had some evidence. So he and all young reporters were forced to work the night shift. And he got many calls from the public about UFO sightings at night. And these calls, he says, were brushed off. He said it's not a conspiracy of silence with journalists because they're already very skeptical due to the many late night crazy calls that they get. They hear from all sorts of people and they get jaded. And he says it's not really a conspiracy as much as it's a professional skepticism just because of the people in the public. This guy Ross tries very hard to take a middle road. Let's watch him veer right off. He says, Isaac Asimov thought that these kinds of claims, UFO claims, were wild and ridiculous, and I admit I insensitively took the view that the people who made these claims were all nutters. Asimov wrote, quote, I believe in evidence. I believe in observation, measurement, and reasoning confirmed by independent observers. I'll believe anything, no matter how wild and ridiculous, if there's evidence for it. The wilder and more ridiculous something is, however, the firmer and more solid the evidence will have to be. It's kind of Ross's point of view going into this. But he observes, he says, that scientists don't agree on what scientific certainty really is. And especially about UFOs, he says it's really apparent to him from the work that he's done that this is the big taboo. Skeptics say that all UFO witnesses are unreliable. And he cites a scientist on a TED Talk saying that UFO eyewitness evidence is not evidence. And he says they always assume that UFOs are alien and extraterrestrial craft. And that's not sound science, which is why they like UAP, because UFO has a cultural weight of being aliens from space. And there's something potentially broader going on. So he says this is not a fair assessment. Eyewitness testimony is used in the criminal justice system all the time. It's used in wildlife science research. It cannot be dismissed just because it's eyewitness. You can't assume every single person who makes a claim is crazy, which is how it's being dealt right now. He said the biggest problem is that UFO sightings are not repeatable by others the way other scientific investigation would be. And it's a prerequisite that to verify a hypothesis, you have to be able to repeat to get your results. I apologize for my dogs. Not my dogs, my neighbor's dogs. They'll go back in a minute because they let the dog out to pee and then they spend 24/7 indoors, so making guns. That's not allegedly. He's a gunsmith and a gun seller next door. So eyewitness evidence does have probative value in most circumstances. His job, Ross's job, lets him go down rabbit holes. It's one of the reasons he really likes it. It lets him see evidence and talk to witnesses, and he knows now that UFOs, it's the biggest unsolved mystery of our age. I would agree. He says most witnesses, one of the problems, most witnesses prefer to remain anonymous because of the social implications, professional etc. He said, but they're illuminating. Good choice of words. And he says, many governments are taking the UFO issue very, very seriously in private. They won't admit it publicly, but there's all kinds of stuff going on in the background. 2/3 of Americans believe a vast conspiracy exists to hide UFOs and ETs. And scientists have a reluctance to encourage conspiratorial thinking. Mainstream journalism, he says, believes that this is, quote, batshit crazy, that it's the great taboo and it's treated with ridicule if it is covered at all. Today, they're having committee hearings on David Grosh, the whistleblower. And what was the headline? Hunter Biden's laptop. So he started digging, and he was shocked at how authoritative many sightings have been, actually documented in multiple ways. Radar, sensors, photographs, videos, and eyewitnesses. And he's also really taken aback by how poorly all of this has been presented to the public. So now, chapter 2, Roswell, the Holy Grail. So this is called Roswell Implausible Denials. In the New York Times in 1945, they described what was called Foo Fighters. These were balls of fire that played around flying U.S. fighter pilots over the Third Reich. And the quote in the Times was, "The Germans have thrown something new into the night skies over Germany." But then they were seen by pilots over the Pacific. And later, it was discovered that they were seen by the Germans and by the Japanese and by the Russians. And their pilots were all followed by these things, toyed with by these things, orbs, basically, orbs. And they thought they were American. So they were seen by pilots everywhere. They were regularly seen over the Pacific and over Europe. They would turn on a dime. They would hover, stop, go fast, turn on a dime. And Americans feared this was a new German secret weapon. After the war, it was found that everyone was blaming everyone else, and nobody knew. WTF. So this escalated globally after the war, the interest in movies. And I mean, remember the 1950s, The Day the Earth Stood Still. But what came first? The sightings or the interest? You know, which fed which? He says, actually, it's an exaggeration that there was a widespread panic, and I'm guilty of perpetuating this myth, that there was a widespread panic during the War of the Worlds, which shows you what a good investigator he is, because most information says there was a widespread panic. He said that was sort of the media hyping it up. There was a little pockets of angst. Some people did kill themselves, but not widespread. February 1946, Sweden reported 2,000 plus ghost rockets. They saw them on radar. Fragments were found. They were not Russian, they knew, based on their structure and their flight style and their slow speed. But they had a high-tech skill not known on Earth. That's the official Swedish report I'm quoting there. These were also seen in the southern hemisphere. February of 1947, there are 3 accounts of 5 egg-shaped wingless UFOs over South Australia. They were seen coming out of the ocean. They seemed to float on the air. They cast a shadow. They were solid. Now, in a lot of these stories, I'm not going into enormous detail. There are descriptions, measurements, colors, sizes, distances. I must spare you that because there's not enough time in the world. But you really need to read this book. It's a mind-boggler. So they also saw them going at great speed, measured more than 260 kilometers northeast. I have no idea how fast that is. The government called them meteors, mirages. But the official government astronomers said, no, they're not astronomical, not in my sky. And they really did hit those speeds, according to the astronomer. 2 months later in New South Wales, a rice farmer saw 5 objects flying in a V formation, and it was established by official astronomer people later they were going more than 1,000 miles an hour. Now, all of this happened just before Roswell. And in May of 1947, there was a new director of the Central Intelligence Agency. This became the CIA. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter. That's a hard name. He was injured at Pearl Harbor, so he was eager to fix intelligence failures. He blamed Pearl Harbor on intelligence failure, and so he was very much focused on this. And when he got these reports about UFOs, he found those a national security threat. So he wanted to detect and identify all craft in airspace for the benefit of national security. And almost immediately, the post-war flying saucer frenzy began, just about the time he became head. So, for example, the 24th of June, 1947, Ken Arnold, very famous case in a small plane. He was searching over Mount Rainier, Washington, for a lost military transport plane. Don't remember if there was a reward, but there was a lot of professional involvement of civilian pilots trying to find this lost transport plane. He saw flashes in the sky and flying saucers going at incredible speeds, and these were confirmed along the ground by air traffic control and eyewitness, multiple locals. The 1st of July of 1947, the similar thing was seen in New Mexico. The 3rd of July in Maine, they saw an object 100 feet in diameter. The U.S. Army Material Command told them, oh, it's just birds. And later the Air Force admitted, well, it's unexplained. July 4th, the United Airlines crew saw somewhere between 5 and 9 discs pacing the airplane. July 4th in Portland, I believe Maine, cops saw them and a carload of people saw them. The U.S. Army admitted officially, we have no idea what they are. That's scary. July 5th, 1947, a rancher, Mac Brazel, found debris 120 kilometers from Roswell, a small town of about 15,000 people in New Mexico. And I have covered several books about Roswell. And the real story is a bit muddied. There were actually a couple of crash sites, and they're intentionally muddied by the military to distract so that the military could collect evidence. And we went into this in great detail. And a lot of people don't talk a lot about this or don't know about it. So this area is a space aerospace technology test area. It was ground zero for nuclear tests, New Mexico, and a lot of airplane experimental stuff is done there. Brazel thought that that's what he was seeing. He eventually, he didn't respond to this thing in the sky that crashed. He didn't go to the site. He didn't look for the site for a couple days. He was working and he couldn't get away. So he eventually went and saw it. And then, he saw it, and then it took him days to report it. And then he went to Roswell to report it to, I think, the sheriff. And they took the information to the Roswell Army Air Force Base. They told intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel, and he was sent out to investigate. Many hypotheses that ETs were monitoring the nuclear tests. One crashed with a live humanoid in it. They also recovered a few bodies, and the claim is a monumental cover-up. The U.S. military had a very clumsy response, and that only added to increased claims there was a cover-up. They gave 4 different explanations for what had happened. First, he says that they did they do this on purpose? Was this a cover-up? He's trying to determine impartially, is there a conspiracy or is this just confusion? So it's true that Brazel showed Jesse Marcel the crash site. Marcel went on the record, said he saw ETs and UFOs and a massive debris field. There was a big gouge in the field, 150 meters long, from the thing skidding to a halt and digging a gouge in the ground. His son confirmed later that Marcel went home with some of the debris and showed them a foil metal sheets that was light, it was strong, and it was impervious to heat. When they hammered it, it wouldn't make a mark. And when they crumbled it up and then let go of it, it was in a crumbled ball and it unfolded itself and was smooth with no wrinkles. So it rearranged itself into a smooth sheet. He also found several pieces of light metal beams that had indecipherable hieroglyphics on them. Marcel's command officer was Colonel William Blanchard, and he sent Marcel with the debris to the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth to show Brigadier General Ramey. Blanchard also told his public information officer to say, put it in the news, this is okay, you can make a public announcement. Hey, the Army found a flying saucer, flying disc. And they did. They put it in the news. And this received an incendiary reception in the national press, as you might imagine at the time. Roswell's evening paper, the Roswell Daily Record, breathlessly reported, quote, the intelligence officer of the 509 bombardment group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. The Army actually never said it was a flying saucer. It only referred to it as a disc. The story also carried claims from locals, Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot, claiming that earlier that week they'd seen a speeding disc overhead that looked oval and shaped like two inverted saucers faced mouth to mouth. The entire body glowed as though light were showing through from the inside. Not surprisingly, this incredible story asserting there was a recovered flying saucer, supposedly the first ever official acknowledgement anywhere in the world, of what was possibly extraterrestrial life, went around the planet like wildfire, drawing huge media interest. Meantime, Marcel finally arrived in Fort Worth, and by the time he got there, Ramey had changed his mind. 3 hours after the first press release that got all over the world, Ramey told the Associated Press, nothing to see here, folks. It was a weather balloon. And then they staged pictures of them with a real weather balloon pieces. And the press believed him and they backed off. That was the end of the official Roswell story. In 1978 to 1986, when he died, Jesse Marcel said that he was ordered to collude in a cover-up. The debris he had was replaced with old weather balloons. Marcel believed that this was extraterrestrial, and he said he was forced to pose with weather balloon pieces for pictures to debunk the story. After he retired, he told the real story to Stanton Friedman. He's a nuclear physicist and a UFO researcher, very famous, well-known in the field. And Jesse Marcel said that this was the cosmic Watergate cover-up. And this was supported by the 1980 book, The Roswell Incident. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force changed its story again. So this would be third time, I think. And admitted, okay, well, it wasn't a weather balloon. It was a top secret balloon project that was made to monitor Soviet nuclear tests called Project Mogul. There were no bodies. There were no aliens. No alien material. So excuse number 4 shows up later in the book, and we'll get to it. Keep that in mind. So the initial report was clear. It was a disc, and what a mogul balloon looked like, because they did exist. What it looked like was nothing remotely like a disc. Blanchard then said the disc was part of a balloon. That, they saw the disc, but the disc was just part of the whole mogul arrangement. In 94, there were no weather balloons, but from mogul, and the mogul balloon in no way looked like a disc. What were Blanchard and Marcel talking about, is Ross's question. In 95, the U.S. Congress General Accounting Office found zero documents of a crash. They'd all been destroyed without authorization. Slate wiped clean. But there were multiple first-hand witnesses, and they all said that the debris was strange, a strange unknown metal. Blanchard said to the editor, "The stuff I saw, I've never seen any place else in my life." He finally, came out and admitted this later. The information officer at Walter, and his name was Walter Hart, on his deathbed, had something to say. Deathbed confessions, they're the best. There's a few of them in this book. It's kind of mind-boggling. An extraordinary deathbed affidavit of former U.S. Army Public Information Officer Lieutenant Walter Hart, who testified in 2002 that he was taken out to a hangar by Colonel Blanchard to view recovered child-sized bodies with abnormally large heads lying under a tarpaulin at the base, the military base. In a statement released after his death, he alleged that Blanchard allowed him to see an apparent alien craft in a hangar approximately 12 to 15 feet in length, not quite as wide, about 6 feet high, and more of an egg shape. Lighting was poor, but its surface did appear to be metallic. He said, "I'm convinced that what I personally observed was some type of craft and its crew from outer space." Hout also alleged Blanchard's press release was a ruse to divert public attention from the main recovery operation of the craft from a different site. Remember I said more than one crashed that weekend. However, that's his dying declaration, which holds great weight in court, by the way. However, he had signed an earlier affidavit with no mention of saucers or discs or ETs, but he claims he was coerced to sign that. The family of former Roswell military who worked the site told them it was alien. ETs, flying saucers, UFOs, who knows what they really are. But there's no evidence. There's no substantial evidence. All record of this is gone. Haut's daughter worked at the Roswell UFO Museum still. And Ross said, I wonder if she has a financial incentive to keep this story going. And he found out from an author named Schmidt, who wrote about all of this, that she got less than minimum wage. And it made no difference how many people came to the museum. She got less than minimum wage. She made no profit from it. And he knew her and said there was no doubt that she was a sincere and truthful person. So Ross says there's no definitive conclusion and it needs to be actively investigated. And extra measures were kept to keep spy balloons secret. Can't read my handwriting here. And aggressive skeptics, after his death, the Harvard astronomer and skeptic Donald Menzel, this is after Jesse Marcel's death, revealed to have worked for several security associations with top secret clearance. So this Harvard astronomer was connected to top secret government programs. That's been proven. Harvard didn't know. And he was the official astronomer who was coming out and saying nothing to see here. Weather, just weather phenomena. So they had co-opted the scientists who could confirm or disavow that this was a real thing. Friedman accused this astronomer of being a disinformation agent to debunk UFO stories. So definitely according to Ross, the mainstream press were gagged, and the public interest just intensified, as we all know. The number of sightings soared, pardon the pun, and there was pressure put on the military to explain what the heck is going on. So Chapter 3, the launch of Project Blue Book. Because of the Cold War, people were hypervigilant about objects in the sky, so there was more attention being paid in general. So many reports of flying discs made General Nathan Twining, the head of the Air Material Command, made him write a letter. He looked into it. There were so many reports. He looked into these reports, and his letter said, quote, "There's something real and not visionary or fictitious going on here." He described physical movement of these objects that the military couldn't do. Any military he was aware of couldn't do. And he strongly recommended a study which led to Project Saucer. Project Saucer eventually was renamed Project Sign in December of 1947, and the Air Force did investigate for about a year. An insider from the Air Force office, Ed Ruprecht, saw a report, he says. This is a kind of a eyewitness report. A report called The Estimate of the Situation, and it claimed that UFOs were interplanetary. This report was released in 1987, finally, heavily redacted, originally from 1947. Project Saucer became Project Sign. Project Sign eventually became Project Grudge. Ross speculates what's the name change about. It's curious. Officially, they debunked everything, but in private, they were taking it very seriously, and they were doing their due diligence research while they were telling people nothing to see here, folks. In late 1949, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, investigating green fireballs seen over military sites, confidentially reported that the continued occurrence of unexplained phenomena of this nature in the vicinity of sensitive installations is cause for concern. That's the official military statement. In 1949, True magazine wrote an article by a guy called Donald Kehoe, a Marine Corps veteran, called Flying Saucers Are Real. This became a book eventually. In the book, the Air Force played down what they knew, and he says they were playing it down to avoid a panic, that they did know stuff, but they were withholding to avoid public panic. The first Project Grudge report admitted that we're shutting this research down because it's going to cause hysteria. Privately, they were still investigating it. So they were telling the public one thing that was supposed to be official results, but they were still continuing in private. Then on the 9th of January 1950, Time magazine did a report about rumors that UFOs and ET bodies were recovered in New Mexico. In March of 1950, the FBI did a report. Hoover said the Air Force investigator claimed 3 saucers were recovered with 3 bodies each, 3 feet tall humanoids in metallic suits. The FBI still says this proves nothing. This is still on record, this report. In April of 1950, 15 people at Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. Now, these are people with high clearance, trusted enough, stable enough, impartial, scientific people working on the nuclear program. 15 of them at Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory watched a UFO hover 2,000 feet in the air for 20 minutes. They describe it as circular, 9 feet in diameter, and faster than any conventional aircraft they were aware of. These are people in the know. 1952 in July in Los Alamos, multiple eyewitnesses saw an egg shape bigger than a jet moving very fast or hanging just motionless. It was fooling around up there. The Air Force said it was paper because they described the movement as fluttering. And that fluttering later has been described as anti-gravity pushing the atmosphere ahead of it to move without needing to burn fuel. And we're talking physics now, so if I'm misunderstanding, don't be the least surprised. May 1950, in Oregon, a farmer took pictures of what looked like a flying saucer. The Air Force admitted, yeah, that's what it looks like. There were 2 ground witnesses as well as the camera pictures. November of 1950, Canadian radio engineer Wilbur Smith saw a top secret memo to the Canadian Department of Transportation. Oh, he sent it. He was an engineer. He had actually worked on a top secret program. In the memo, he used his contacts to reach out to Dr. Robert Sanchez, a U.S., maybe I got that name a little bit wrong, but a U.S. government research and development member of a research and development board. And he substantiated as correct this next story. Let's see what this says here. Three years before his death, okay, it wasn't Sanchez. I just couldn't read my handwriting. This is Dr. Sarbacher, which gives you a clue as to what my handwriting looks like. Dr. Sarbacher wrote to researcher William Steinman and said, quote, relating to my own experience regarding recovered flying saucers, I had no association with any of the people involved in the recovery. I have no knowledge regarding the dates of the recoveries. Certain materials reported to have come from flying saucer crashes were extremely light and very tough. I remember in talking with some of the people at the office that I had got the impression these aliens were constructed like certain insects we have observed on Earth. I still do, like the entities. I still do not know why the high order of security classification has been given and why the denial of the existence of these devices. Well, so that's the report that this Canadian radio engineer was privy to and passed on this information. And in 1950, Frank Scully wrote Behind the Flying Saucers and claimed multiple crashes and retrievals and ET bodies and UFOs in New Mexico, that they used electromagnetic propulsion, hence the fluttering. Smith's son James, Wilbur Smith the Canadian, his son James claims that he was with his father when he was shown all this stuff, and he saw small humanoid bodies. Interestingly enough, Ross says this was never actually denied by the American government or by the Canadian government. All these documentations, all these eyewitnesses, and they're silent. In 1952, the agency's assistant director of scientific intelligence advised, quote, flying saucers pose 2 elements of danger which have national security implications. The first involves mass psychological considerations, and the second concerns the vulnerability of the U.S. to air attack. His now declassified secret memorandum clearly acknowledged that UFOs were an extremely important national security concern that he urged should be scientifically investigated. This is the assistant director of the Scientific Intelligence Agency of the government. So Ross says you have to be careful because this is all hearsay. He told me this. My dad said that he saw. I'm telling you that I saw, but there's no evidence. It's all hearsay. Sarbacher's son said that his dad told him that UFOs were real and they maneuvered separate from inertia and gravity. His father was an engineer. But this is unverified. In 1952, the CIA document made lots of excuses. Oh, hysteria. People are crazy. It's a hoax. But it did not explain the sightings in Los Alamos or at Oak Ridge Nuclear Laboratory. And they have an inexplicable recording of a huge rise in background radiation at the time of these sightings. Can't explain them. The military says we're left with numbers of incredible reports from credible observers at the time. They admitted that. Oh, I already read it. In 1952, Project Grudge was renamed Project Blue Book. This might sound more familiar. And the question they were trying to answer is, were UFO security threat, a national security threat? Numerous military pilot sightings on radar of inexplicable objects verified as solid objects traveling at high speed. The Air Force investigated 12,618 UFO sightings from civil and military pilots, and a small percentage of them are 100% unexplained. They write off some of them, weather balloons, aerial phenomena, weather phenomena, but 100%, a small percent, they cannot even concoct an excuse. Scientist Dr. Jay Hynek on Project Blue Book and Project Sign went into it thinking this whole thing was ridiculous. He's a scientist. This is nonsense, right? But he said the military can't discount their own trained personnel. These guys are trained observers. They're knowledgeable about aeronautics. They're familiar with all the latest hardware in the air. How can you just dismiss them as being crazy? You're giving them these important, expensive things to fly to protect us, and then you call them crazy. He said there are two schools of thought. You have to take it seriously, or the other school of thought is it can't be true, therefore it isn't, so debunk it. The Air Force kept other branches of the military in the dark, and this was a problem when the Secretary of the Navy and an admiral were followed on separate planes from Hawaii to Guam by flying saucers. And when they reported this, they discovered, oh, geez, the Air Force has known about this all the time. They were really mad. Secretary Kimball told the Navy people, and they've discovered that many on both planes saw all of this, including the pilots of the plane. And a lot of these guys were military, big, high up government military people. Kehoe said that he was told by these professional pilot people that what they saw was traveling faster than 2,000 miles an hour. So Secretary Kimball filed a report with the Air Force and got no response. This made him mad. So he started his own investigation, and he was forced by higher-ups, brass in the Air Force, and there aren't that many more higher up, to stop the investigation. The Admiral became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Two top Navy people reported discs, but it's not on the official record. No findings were ever disclosed. This guy became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His report disappeared. Many sightings happened at crucial nuclear weapon sites. June of 52, two pilots saw saucers hover over the Atomic Energy Commission at Hanford, their bomb-making factory in Richland, Washington. The Air Force told the investigators to stall the press with no comment. So UFOs are flying over a nuclear bomb manufacturing factory, and the Air Force response is stall the press, no comment. July 19th, 1952, Washington, D.C. Radar showed a large flap. A flap is a group event of UFOs over Washington, D.C.'s National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base. The radar tracked one going 7,000 miles an hour. They were there for more than 6 hours. There were a minimum of 10 UFOs sighted over the White House and the Capitol building, and there are photographs of that. I have seen them. And they were in the paper that night. They returned the next week, and on July 26th, dozens were on radar seen by pilots. Fighter jets were sent up, and these things disappeared from the sky. Not the fighter jets, the UFOs disappeared. Washington National Airport Control Tower, radar room, everyone said, these are solid metal objects. We see them. This was front page news globally. The Pentagon had the biggest press conference since World War II. The U.S. Air Force Director of Intelligence, Major General John Sanford said, "Oh, it's okay, everybody. Just a freak weather event." But in secret, they were freaking out. The government established the Robertson panel, with the CIA director, Smith, being the one to instigate this. CIA was freaking out. Something is going on that must have immediate attention, so they made the panel. Serious national security concerns are at play here. This is not a natural event, not natural phenomena, not known aerial vehicles of any country we are aware of. Hynek saw that the panel was created intentionally to debunk everything and get control of the investigation back into the hands of the Air Force. The CIA began playing them down. Hynek said that it was his observation that the CIA was fearful of the UFO reports. In January of 1953, the panel said that the UFOs were no threat to national security. They recommended training programs to teach people in the military how to debunk this. Why? There's powerful evidence. There's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saw them, and not alone. He saw them with other trained military people. July of 1953 at Perrin Air Force Base in Texas, 7 UFOs in a Z shape were between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, hovering above the Air Force Base with had red lights. In August of 1953 in South Dakota, they were seen by many at an Air Force base. Jets were scrambled. Fighter jets were scrambled and followed them. There were thousands of reports, and many were completely unexplained. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'll be back. There's going to be probably 5, 6 videos. I will try very hard to condense them and talk fast. I have a discussion scheduled about this book. It's going to be real fun. It's not Ross. He's in high demand, and I'm not MSNBC. So. However, this will be really a fun conversation, and I hope you guys will stay tuned for this. And if you think this is crazy so far, stick around. And in the meantime, Slán go fóill. Slánte.